Although this is the last presentation of today, this is my first presentation in this conference, my first appearance at this conference, so I'm very, very grateful to be here. I'm very, very grateful to be anywhere, frankly, because this is only the second talk I've done in person in 26 months. So I don't get out much over the pandemic. In fact, the look that I have here is what I'm trying to persuade my wife is a new look called Pandemic Business Casual. I don't always look this way. If you look me up on LinkedIn or anything else, you'll see how I looked before all this broke out. So I'm going to talk to you today about this, governing the ungovernable, one giant leap. The only thing that I can hope is that some or all of you will be slightly familiar with the Apollo program, because if not, some of the references are just going to go straight past you. So, about ISC, I'm hoping that many of you will know a little bit about ISC. I know that at least 5 of you in the audience today know a lot about ISC because we work together there, although I only met you last night for the first time. It's good to see that you aren't just sort of malicious artificial intelligence bots on the end of a Zoom call. It's nice to know when your actual workmates are real people. We're a non-profit organization. Of course, we get out the door BIND and DHCP and KIA, and then for purposes of this talk, what's most important is that we manage froot, one of the 12 root servers on the internet, and we manage more than 300 instances of that root server, including root servers instances that are located in Edinburgh, London, and right here in Manchester. I mean, not right here, not in this room. Ray can tell you exactly where they are, or maybe Ray won't tell you exactly where they are. You don't need to know. You know, they're somewhere in Manchester, let's put it that way. About me, I've been a lawyer for 30 years. I've been doing this a long time. You can read this at your leisure. The slide is available for you to download at your joy. All of my comments are personally. Nothing that I say up here can be attributed to anybody other than my silly self. Now, today's agenda, I want to talk you very, very quickly through the history of the root server system. I want to talk a little bit about how the European Union decided that it wanted to take over the root server system. Maybe. And then I want to talk to you about where we are in terms of like changing the governance structure for the root server system. In other words, a lot of this talk is going to be about the root server system. So if you signed up for something else, you're definitely in the wrong room. So a brief history of the root server system as told by a lawyer really quickly. Once upon a time, there were guys named John Pistel and Paul Macapetras who set up the first root server in 1984. You can get all this stuff from a publication called RSAC 023, and I've got slides, I've got little charts that show that coming up. So they set up the first root server. Within a year, they decided they needed 3 more. By 1991, they decided they wanted 6. By 1995, they decided they wanted 9, and then they renamed them to the naming convention we have today, x.root-servers.net, letters A through I. Once they did the renaming, that freed up some technological jiggery-pokery that Ray can explain to you and I cannot, which meant you could add 4 new letters, J, K, L, and M, who were assigned to NSI, USC, RIPE, and WIDE. The L root went to ICANN. A and J ended up being acquired by VeriSign when they took over NSI. Cogent took over PSINet in 2002, and they took over C root. And that's it. Nothing has changed hands in 20 years. So as of today, here's your list. Here are the players. Here are the 12 organizations in the world who run the Internet's root servers as we know them, and their IP addresses. Not that you need to know that, but it's helpful. You never know. So in numbers, we have 12 root server operators using 13 root letter addresses that resolve to, at last count that I did, 1,530 root server instances located in more than 100 sovereign states. The system is run 24/7, 365, without interruption, without a hiccup, without a problem noticeable to any end users for more than 3 decades. It's a pretty resilient, pretty good working system. The people who run it know what they're doing, and they spend a lot of time getting it right. We don't get paid to get it right, but we spend a lot of time and effort getting it right. So, second topic for today, NIS2, the draft NIS2 Directive in the European Union. The accidental? I'm not sure. RSS killer? No one's quite sure. Maybe, maybe not. So what's the deal? Most of you will already be familiar since until a couple years ago, we used to live in Europe. That's a raw nerve, isn't it? Most of you will be familiar with the original NIS directive. And most of you will be familiar with the fact that the folks in Brussels want to revise that directive with something they're calling NIS2. So why is that a problem for the root server system, or the root server operators? And it has to do with the geographic scope of the regulation, because in the original Commission draft, they specifically took aim at and wanted to regulate everyone who provides a root server service to anyone in the European Union. That's the scope that they wanted originally this directive to take. Problem, of course, as all of you know better than I do, because I'm only a lawyer, is that the RSS is a globally unified system. And if you look at the list of people who are RSOs, you'll find that all 12 manage some equipment physically present in the European Union. And furthermore, people in the European Union send queries to root servers that are geolocated inside Europe and outside Europe, which means that they're sending queries to all 12 root server operators. Therefore, regulating these people means regulating all 12 of them. And from what I've been told, the folks in Brussels desperately tried to figure out how do you only regulate some of them and not others, and they started to come around to the understanding you can't do it. Can't do it. Not the way things are run currently. Of course, we hope things will continue the way they run currently, in the sense that nobody cares about the geolocation of the root server operators, but that's another story. We hope. So the problem for us as a root server operator, and for our 11 colleagues who do the same thing, so why are you worried about this regulation? It's just about making things better, isn't it? Making things stronger, making things more secure. Isn't that a good thing to do? Well, it's a good thing to do, although number one, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We already have things in place which suggest we don't have a problem that needs fixing. And if you are going to fix it, our concern is this: the slippery slope of national regulation. Because if you tell 27 member states of the European Union that each of them has to embody in their domestic laws a regulation which arguably must be used to regulate a root server operator, and yes, all 27 member states would have to adopt this into their domestic laws, which means already we know for sure there would be 2 root server operators regulated by 2 different national authorities, and all the rest of us would be regulated by, well, that's kind of an interesting question. One of them? Many of them? Now you multiply that problem, because once people get the idea that, oh, regulating root server operators, why don't we do that? Well, you just expand this problem out to sovereign state 192 or 193. Regulation doesn't really scale particularly well when you're subject to the rules of more than 100 places. It makes your life miserable. It makes my life profitable. As a lawyer, I've spent all of my time trying to answer a client's questions about how to comply with 193 different laws. I'd have to hire a staff. You know, it'd be great. I'd be like the single largest budget center for our company instantly. Not an attractive proposition. Not something we want, not something anybody else wants. And besides, isn't this the sort of thing that the multi-stakeholder system was designed to solve? I'd certainly hope so. Now, the European Parliament, in a blindingly brilliant step of common sense, led by the rapporteur for the relevant committee, came up with this comment right here in their report when they were looking at this regulation. They said, you know, regulating root server operators is contrary to the European Union's own vision of a single, open, neutral, free, secure, and unfragmented network. This is not something we should be doing, said the rapporteur, who's a very, very qualified individual, not just a lawmaker. He's not a lawyer, thank heavens. He said this could really encourage a bunch of those other sovereign states that we'd really not like to talk about in reports like this, the kinds of places that would love nothing more than to regulate the internet from the top down. If you want to regulate the internet from the top down, this is where you start. So why are we doing this? If we do this, all the usual suspects will just line up and want to do it too. So let's not do it. And the European Parliament said, yep, We can get on board with that. So by the end of 2021, they had said root servers, they didn't just take them out of the draft, they specifically wrote in language that says, we are not regulating root server operators. Yay, big victory. Now the only problem is that in order to pass European law, you have to have the agreement of the European Commission and the European Council. A little bit of a, not quite sure where that's going. So we're waiting for the results of what's called the trilogue procedure this year. Keep your eyes on this. Last, biggest, most important subject for discussion. Where are we in terms of root server system governance? And the challenge is this. Is there a root server system governance structure today? Is there? Is there? To find the answer, have a look at or think about the difference between a technical standard and a governance structure. A technical standard talks about what things do, what technical systems do. A governance structure exists to influence the behavior of people. And I mean companies as well, but when I say people, lawyers always mean companies as well. Influence the behavior of people. Well, looked at that way, when we ask the question, we discover that yes, there is a governance structure for the root server system. It's governance, Jim, but not as we know it. It's relatively informal, but it works. It has worked for more than 3 decades. It's kept the thing running 24/7, 365 for 3 decades. That's a history of success. But it began to dawn. We can improve it, we should improve it, we can make it better, we can update it, we can bring it into the 21st century, we can change and formalize the governance structure, and we should. Is it going to be easy? No. Because you have to get a lot of people lined up behind what the new thing is going to look like. So, we don't do things because they're easy, we choose to do things sometimes because they are hard. So, President Kennedy's famous comment in 1960-something or other, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to develop a root server system, governance system, not because it's easy. The root server operators themselves convened 3 years of workshops to try to set out on paper what a governance structure should include, what should be in there, what are the principles that make the system successful, and that resulted in the publication of RSAC 037. A 50-page document that talks about a proposed governance model for the root server system, and RSAC 038, a 1-page letter addressed to the ICANN Board of Directors that said, essentially, this would be a good idea. Can you make this happen? We think this is the way forward. Fantastic. By the way, your acronym bingo card, RSAC, the Root Server System Advisory Committee. It's one of these, multiple groups that circle around, that orbit the ICANN universe, that does things. RSAC is, as the name suggests, an advisory group. It's just the 12 members who run root servers and other stakeholders from the ICANN community who sit down together once a month in a relatively formal setting and exchange ideas and do publications. It gives advice. So what advice did it give? RSAC 037, we need something like this. RSAC 038, ICANN Board of Directors, can you make this happen? Well, guess what? We have liftoff. The ICANN Board of Directors responds very warmly to this recommendation. They convene a series of discussions with the greater community, however you want to define that. And at the end of that, they invite stakeholders who are directly involved with taking information out of the root server system and, architecting it, all sorts of stuff. And they put together a root server system governance working group, the GWG. I'm going to be saying GWG a lot, so just get used to it. And they say, hey, GWG, here's a roadmap, 037. This is how you get to the moon. Do something like this. Well, those of you who've seen Apollo 13 will know that things do not always go according to plan. And Houston, we have a problem. And the problem is, for a variety of reasons that you can reach your own conclusion about, the GWG starts to diverge significantly from the principles and values expressed in RSAC 037. They start to come up with their own vision of what they think governance structure should look like. Now, that caused what I'm describing here as unrest among the various stakeholders. We'll just, unrest, I think, is a nice lawyerly diplomatic word. We'll just call it that. So how do you structure a communication that advances the cause? Option one, always fun. Everyone shout at each other over the phone, in meetings, whatever it happens to be. And that's emotionally satisfying, but it doesn't really bake the biscuits. So, option two, some very well-intentioned people involved in the discussion said, hey, wait a minute, well, we've got some other models that you might want to look at. Why don't you take this one off the rack and try it on, see if it fits? And that's when sort of it slowly dawned that, wait a minute, if we have to compare and contrast different models, how would we be able to do that? Do we have any kind of a framework that we can use to assess whether or not this meets the needs of a governance structure? So option three is let's pull back a little bit and create a framework to analyze these things. And that's precisely where the giant leap comes in. And that is the adoption of a series of success criteria for what a good governance structure should look like, what it should include. And that's RSAC 058, 21 pages, and the accompanying one-page recommendation to the ICANN Board of Directors, RSAC 049, published on the 17th of November, and the very next day, the ICANN Board of Directors had a special session just to discuss this document, and they said, yep, we're on board. That's a great course correction. That's where we should go. And they sent that as a package down to GWG. Now, what does that document actually say, RSAC 058? Many of you will have already downloaded it. You're not listening to me at all. That's fine. I lecture at a university. I understand students who don't want to listen to what's going on. You've all got internet connectivity. I remember the first time I spoke to a Wi-Fi Open Standards Working Group in the late 1990s was the first talk I ever gave where no one was listening to me. They were all checking their email. So I'm not at all offended. Do whatever you need to do. Make your employers happy. Earn money. Do whatever. Get your fantasy football league put together. Whatever you're doing, that's fine. But if you have a moment, if you're looking at 058, RSAC 058 begins by looking back on a history of root server system governance success. Series of 3 slides here that build. The first says, over the course of decades, root server operators have what? 3 conditions, 3 outputs. The conditions: we've acted collectively, we've acted collaboratively, and we've remained individually independent. What are the success outputs? We have defined the principles that make the RSS work. We have delivered the service in accordance with those principles, and we have served to maintain trust in the integrity of the system. Trust in the integrity of the system. You don't want people in the world to start questioning what the root server operators are serving up. That takes us all to a very bad place. We don't want to go. It goes on to say this. From the very early days, the RSOs, root server operators, have undertaken both an operational and a collective governance role. It's an acknowledgement. It took a while in the workshop to sort of like pull this out of all the people who were participating because, like, you know, are we really doing governance? Have we been doing governance for 30 years? It's like, well, do you make decisions that influence the behavior of your other root server operators? Are you influenced by things, inputs and outputs? Do you influence the... Well, yeah, absolutely. My friends, that's a governance structure. So, you have been defending the principles that make it work, and you've been defending those principles against all those who threaten them, which means if we look forward to a future of success, we want the continuing status of root server operators as autonomous and independent entities with a significant voice in governance. And then we get into the actual substance of the success criteria. When you look at them, you'll see that the success criteria are broken up into 3 different categories. The substantive criteria, which are really the guts of the governance structure. The transition process criteria, and then what I call the clear statement criteria, which basically, that last category is just to make sure that we're not pushing too many decisions downstream to some later, you know, we get kind of tired of this, oh, we'll figure that out later. Or even better, some czar of the internet will individually decide that later. No, we're not having that. We need to figure out what we're doing now. Nearly all of these criteria are principles-based, which means they can be in tension with one another. They will be in tension with one another. You can't max out the score, and by the way, there is no score. There are no scores, there are no points. You can't do a point system. These are all just differing qualitative values that you have to assess on their own. But they will be in tension with each other. You have to find a balance. And finding a balance requires negotiation. Negotiation and agreement. That's what we're facing now. So, how do we get to agreement? Last two slides. In terms of getting to agreement on the substance of the matter, you begin with principles. You boil those down to a description, you operationalize those in something sticky, and then you reach completion. Or, in the context of RSAC 058, trying to interpret what's going on there, you start with RSAC 058, which also reads in a series of other documents published by RSAC that describe these principles, etc. RSAC 037, 055, 042, 049, all these things are read in. You use that to produce a functional description of a governance structure that everyone can sign off on. And then once you have that, you then develop and draft constitutional documents. Those might be contracts, memoranda of understanding, shareholding agreement. We don't know what that form that's going to take. That's all up for discussion later on. Sort of think of it as the legalization process, where things start to get expensive. You don't want to move to the expensive phase until you've settled the principles. And then assent, signatures, and Bob's your uncle. In terms of the process, it's a pretty simple process, so I'll just step you through it very quickly. Basically, these folks over here produce documents that look like that with governance values and principles, send it to these folks over here at the board of directors who say, hey, yeah, we're completely on board with that, we endorse this, and we're going to convene this group of stakeholders who should take a look at these things. This is where we are right now. GWG is charged with, can you please do something? What is it we're asking them to do? Produce a functional description of the governance structure, which is then sent to what I've described as the assenting entities, the people who need to sign up, the people whose agreement you need. And in trying to identify them, it's certainly going to be the ICANN board of directors, and it's going to be the RSOs, and if you have to change the bylaws of ICANN in order to make all this work, you're also going to need to warm up what's called the empowered community, which is all sort of like, ICANN doublespeak. Once that's in there, you ask these assenting entities to review and revise to the extent necessary the functional description, and then you think, okay, now that we got the functional description, we can turn it over to the operationalization phase, create the constitutional documents, sign them up, and that's the end of the structure. So this is a process chart that only a lawyer could love. I've actually put the things in different shapes to show you the difference between incorporated entities, associations, committees. This is a very sort of like lawyerly kind of thing, but I've also done a little bit of process in there, so happy to do all of that. Now, the little screen in front of me has just gone yellow, which means I have 1 minute and 46 seconds in which to conclude this talk and answer your questions. But since that's my last slide, I'll just say thank you, and then I'll take your questions anyway.
Thank you, Robert. We actually have 6 minutes for questions because that's till the end of your speaking slot. We have 5 more minutes for questions after that. And I can see there are already some people on their feet, so...
Hi, well, there's a quick, naive question. The technical community pushed back on the EU regulating the root server operators, partly for reasons of extraterritoriality, perhaps, and it was successful. Is there a similar agreement in place, perhaps, between the US government and ICANN for the contents of the root zone file?
Well, that's a great question, and it's ever so slightly out of scope from what we're talking about here, because we're not talking about the contents of the root zone file itself. We're talking about how to serve it up. And that process, the transition of IANA from being a U.S. federal government controlled process to an ICANN managed process is a separate process that's taken its own weird set of twists and turns. So ICANN is the body that owns the thing that manages that. That's the best answer I can give you. I don't know if it answers your question.
No, I expect it was SEP. Thanks.
It's what lawyers do. I just give long answers that don't say anything. Well, you look familiar.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm the remote questions monitor. I have a question from P. Hessler, who asks, other than the jurisdiction question, how do you feel about the NIS directives for name server operators, root, CCTLD, resolver, etc.?
I have to confess that I don't have really strong feelings one way or another about NIS2 as it applies to other infrastructure, other parts of the infrastructure of the internet. I think that CCTLD registries are going to probably not be able to resist the onslaught of regulation. I think where the tension is going to arise is with the GTLD registries, because you're going to end up with, they're clearly in the frame. I mean, no matter what VeriSign does, they're going to end up regulated, I think. Sorry, guys, I love those folks. They're our fellow root server operator. I hate to say that, but I mean, that's my prediction for what I think is going to happen. But then again, you know, they've got very broad shoulders.
Do we have any other questions in the room? Or online?
Any criticisms, critiques?
So this may show my ignorance, but in terms of the overall governance of this, what legal jurisdiction would it come under? And in particular, you know, would it be best placed with a treaty organisation like the ITU or something like that, or is it a where does it actually?
Wow, you've just become very popular, Craig. Yes. Well, you see, here's the thing about treaty organizations. In theory, they sound great. You know, let's have a club of all the sovereign states of the world who want to sign up to a treaty, and we'll do something. The reality is much stickier and very uncomfortable. The glory that is the internet, I think it's significant that the glory that we know as the internet did not come out of the ITU. It did not come out of that sort of top-down standards-making process. It's always been a very grassroots infrastructure. It's always been a very bottom-up infrastructure. For the 30 years I've been involved with the internet, which probably there's many people I'm sure who've done it longer than I have, everything that's made the internet what it is comes from somewhere else and just pushes its way up the ladder. And I think that the brilliance that is the multi-stakeholder structure of ICANN is it's something that I didn't originally, I often wondered if it would be possible, which is how do we act collaboratively between that grassroots, very empowered private entity, non-state entity organization, and also take account of, or at least have an opportunity to take in the views of sovereign states, which of course they do through the Governmental Advisory Committee, the GAC, is one of the communities that is part of the multi-stakeholder system. So I personally would be, I think, very disappointed if this structure were suddenly just to be taken over by brute force by sovereign states. But I mean, that's what it would be. I mean, if the sovereign states of the world decided that, you know, we've got the guns, we've got the bullets, we've got the armies, we can take whatever we want. That's how the world works, as we're sadly seeing these days. I would hate to see it happen to the root server system. I think we'd lose something significant if that happened. Not the least of which, the technical expertise of the people who've been running it for 30 years. That's not to be sniffed at. You just don't want this thing to fail. You just don't, you know.
If there are no more questions, I think that's a brilliant place to end. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you very much.